Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted this Jack Russell. Now I did upload another YouTube video featuring a short coated Jack Russell last month, and it's this one here in the corner. And I had a couple of questions about this Jack Russell and how I painted it, so I decided to make a slower tutorial for Patreon. So the just over 6-hour video is available over there now, so if that is of interest I will link that in the description below. And I do also have a YouTube version of that Jack Russell, which I will link in the description below as well. So for this Jack Russell here, he did have a different fur texture. Now regardless of the texture that I am working on for that pet portrait, I will always follow the same rules and guidelines for my base layer stages. I want to make sure that I've got my base layer foundation accurate to that reference photo fairly early on. Now although we're going to be able to make changes to those layers with those acrylics because they are such a forgiving medium, I do find it's best to try and get it as close to that reference photo as possible. Now I don't mean in terms of the colour, because I do use glazes a lot to get the colour where it should be, more for my later layers. But here, as you can see, I'm mapping in where my lights and my darks are. My brushwork here is showing through because the first layer is going to be a little bit more transparent. I am using the Liquitex basics, which are naturally a little bit thinner looking, but I do like that because they work well for glazes. When I add my second layer on top here, you can see that now the layer is far more opaque. You can't see as much of the background colour showing through. And because I like working in layers like this, and as I say, I do use glazes an awful lot, how thin these paints are here and how transparent they are, it doesn't cause any problem for me at all. I actually think it's a plus side. So here now you can see the shape of the face is coming through, and that's all in where I'm putting my lights and my darks. Now I also have a video here on YouTube that's talking about my top tips for painting fur, so I will also link that in the description below too. And there I really do focus one of the tips on contrast. Now I speak about this in all of my tutorials because it's really important, but for this reference photo that I was working from, the light source was more from behind the animal, so this side of the face was a little darker. I had to make sure therefore that my contrasts were sharp to replicate that. My shadows need to be nice and dark, and then here where I'm building up my highlights, I'm building up those values gradually. One of the biggest things that can happen is we are too tempted to paint in the details too early on. Those lighter details that we see when we first look at the reference photo need to be left more for our last layers. Even here with the values I'm adding now, these are still not my last layers. This very much is a layering process, and it has to be done gradually. Now on my Patreon tutorials I do mention a lot about the importance of subtle layers, and these are layers where at the time you don't think they're going to make too much of a difference, but by the time you put your future layers on top, you've added so much more depth with those subtle layers. It makes that fur so much more realistic, and then the artwork is more three-dimensional. And here I am working from dark to light. Most of the time with acrylics that is typically how I am going to work, but there are going to be exceptions. But here, because that fur is showing those darker greys where it's got some of that shadow from the layers that are closest to the skin, I do need to build up my layers gradually from dark to light. Now, any pet portrait, any painting you're working on, if you'll find that the details here, like what I'm creating, are not showing up enough, but you know the colour that you've mixed is right in terms of how bright it is, it will usually be that if the details are not showing up, that the layer underneath isn't dark enough. Go ahead and make that darker, and then those details will show up more. Now something else that can happen, if you think one part, let's say you've got a section where it is white fur and you're using titanium white, your brightest white, but the details still don't look bright, but you obviously then can't go any brighter. The cause of that is because usually whatever is next to it isn't dark enough. So for instance, the top of the eyebrow here, that is nice and bright, but it might not have been as bright if I didn't have the shadow to the left of it as dark as what it currently is. As soon as you make those shadows next to that highlight darker, it's automatically going to make your bright values appear lighter. And take this ear for example. So I've got a couple of layers down, my first base layer and then my additional base layer, just to get that layer of refinement in place, and then I can start adding my details. Here though, you will notice that at the very first layer it still looks like I've got that 3D shape of the ear, and that's because I haven't gone down with one solid colour. I am paying attention to where my shadows are and my highlights. I can then build up my layers gradually. Just like what I'm doing on the face here, the process is exactly the same. The biggest tip, as always, is to really study that reference photo. That's telling you where your lights and your darks need to be. So there was a prime example. I was just applying a brown glaze across some of my highlights. Again, this is why I like using Liquitex Basics. You could see there that I didn't actually have to mix a brown paint and then paint in those details with my liner brush. I was able to go in more with my grey values, wait for that to dry, and then go over the top with a brown glaze to adjust that colour where needed. And this is why colour for the very first stages and the first layers are not important at all. The glazing and the way that it works, you can worry about the colour later on. At this stage, just focus on your values. That's what's going to make your artwork more realistic. And I know I say it a lot, but it is so important. The tip video that I've got here on YouTube really does show that. You can see that an artwork that is less contrasted compared to something that's got more sharp contrast is going to look flatter because you just don't have the same form with the shadows and highlights. The artwork will just not have the same impact. You could have a painting that's exactly the right colour but the contrast isn't right, and it just will not have the same wow factor. Compare that to another painting where the colour is ever so slightly off but the contrasts are good. That artwork is going to get far more attention. And something to consider with colour is this dog, for instance, it was taken on a sunny day. The dog was on the beach. If this was taken inside, maybe a flash was used, the colour of the fur is going to be different. Time of day, the environment, there are so many different things that affect the overall white balance of a photo. If you were sent 5 or 10 photographs of the pet that you're painting, you can almost be certain that every photo is going to show the colour slightly differently. So it's the contrast that I always focus on from the very beginning. Now, of course, all that being said, I still want to make sure that I'm getting the colour as close as I can do, but the important thing for me is I do not worry about that at all at this early stage. I can do all of that later on. And I think it's really important because picking and mixing the exact colour can really hold us back from painting anything at all. We can end up getting very frustrated with the colours that we're trying to mix and what we can see in our reference photo. It really doesn't have to be as stressful as that. Leave it until the last layers. It really will make a difference. Now, if you are struggling with colour selection, you can use an eyedropper tool, and I talk about this in the Patreon tutorials. I do have a video there where I'm showing you how you can use one of those and design your layouts on a computer before you put any paint on your canvas. But an eyedropper tool will help you to pinpoint and pick a specific part of your reference photo, and it will then isolate that one colour and bring it up in a larger section so you can clearly see exactly what colours you need to mix. Now, even that to a degree can be a little bit misleading, but what it will tell you is where that colour falls on the colour wheel. Now, I do not really focus on what colours I need to mix exactly. What I want to go for is, let's say I'm trying to mix a brown. I want to know, is that brown more on the yellower end of the colour wheel, so I'll need more yellow ochres, or is it more on the cooler end of the colour wheel and I'll maybe need like a raw umber type brown. So those are how I personally select my colours, rather than worrying about the exact shade of brown. It is just whether or not it's a warm brown or a cool brown. And by narrowing down the colour selection like that, it makes it so much easier and far less daunting. So going back to the texture of the fur here that I am creating, you'll notice that the brush strokes are all random. They're slightly curving in different directions. When you're working on a little bit more of a coarser type of fur like this, that is in between being a short-coated and long-coated dog, having that slight variety in the brush strokes is going to make the painting more realistic. You don't want to be creating the same brush strokes all over because you're then going to make it look like a smoother coated dog. You also want to be following the fur direction closely, accurately to that reference photo. The reason being, if that fur direction is slightly off, it is going to change the underlying bone and muscular structure of that animal. What will then happen is, as you get more of the painting done, it won't resemble as much like that pet as it should do. So the fur direction is crucial. It's something that I put an awful lot of emphasis on my slower tutorials because, as I say, it really does affect the overall shape of the animal's face. And that's regardless of anything that you're working on. You know, from a dog to a tiger, it would be exactly the same. You want to get that as closely to the reference photo as you possibly can. So a big tip with any pet portrait that we're working on is following that light source. Now, having a strong light source can make a real impact to the painting. So this here did have that stronger light source that I've mentioned, but I want to make sure here that I've got my highlights in the right place. One thing that can be very tempting is when we start adding those light highlights, it makes such a difference to the overall piece that we have a tendency then to put them everywhere. What happens is we'll then change the overall light source. The painting will therefore look a little flatter. So occasionally when I am working on one area like the nose here and the muzzle, I will zoom in on the reference photo where I've got my tablet there next to my easel. However, when I am trying to get the feel of the overall lighting to make sure that I'm following it closely, at times I will then zoom out of my reference photo and look at the image as a whole. That then helps me to then look at that painting and really see where are my brightest highlights and where are my darkest shadows, because again, I don't want to be putting my shadows in places where they're not needed. That will also change what that animal looks like. You're shifting then the bone and muscular structure. And the reason being, this dog here, it shows it really well. Look where the shadows are. Wherever the darkest parts of the greys are, it's usually where you've got a transition in the fur direction. So for instance, above the area I'm working on here, that is darker because it's sloping over from the top of the bridge of the nose across to where the cheek would be. So all of these shadows really do influence what this dog's going to look like. Now, of course, in some cases, you're going to have shadows because the dog is darker in colour. Maybe the light source is going to be different. There are things that are going to affect that. But certainly in this case here, shifting where those shadows are, like above the eye, you've got the brightest white highlights and then a shadow above it. That there is indicating that the top of the eye socket is joining onto the front surface of the skull. So it is all there for a reason. So it's so important that we get those in accurately. Now, one thing that I always do, and you'll know this if you've seen other tutorials here on YouTube, I like to work in small sections. Especially something like this. This fur texture here is quite challenging. It's a little bit more complex than if we're working on a smoother coated dog, like the Jack Russell I showed at the beginning of the video. If I was to approach this in individual layers, so I paint the whole base layer for the entire face and then the second layer and so on, I do think I'd get very overwhelmed by the entire process. But because I am only focusing on a couple of square inches at one time, I'm able to be a lot more effective with how I work. I also like working like this because it prevents me from being in that ugly stage for far too long. Now, the very first two base layers are not the pretty stage. You know, it does look like I've painted it with my feet, but it's totally normal. It's meant to look like that. But if I stay at that stage by working in more of my larger areas, I find that I'm going to be disheartened for longer because I want to get past that stage. So for me here now, if I decided to leave this painting day here and start again the following day, I'm already motivated to pick up those brushes again because it looks like this dog. I can look back at my painting and the reference photo and think, yep, I've already done it. It looks like the pet that I'm painting. It does help to keep you motivated throughout all of the stages. So now that I've zoomed out, you can really see how important the contrasts are. Because the eyebrows are really quite bright in certain details, it makes them look like they're further forward, even that they're sitting over the top of the eye. That is all because I've got my contrasts right. If the white here was not as bright, the eyebrows would not look as close to the viewer, as far forward. Whenever I'm painting a pet portrait or any subject, I always want to achieve that look of, if someone was to stroke this dog in front of you, you would potentially then, the closest thing to the viewer would be the nose, then the bridge of the nose, then the eyes, the top of the head, and then the ears. I want to try and achieve that in my painting so that anybody that looks at it can see that the nose looks closer to the viewer. You're then going to reach the eyes, but the eyebrows now look like they're on top of the head, which is exactly the effect that I want to create. So, as I say, the biggest tip, if you do find that you're not achieving that in your paintings, it will be your contrast that is not quite right. Make your shadows darker, your highlights brighter, and you'll be able to create more of this 3D form here. Another big tip as well is when you are working on a pet portrait, any subject with longer type of fur like this, always make sure that you overlap those details onto the background. You always want to be studying that closely to the reference photo. You don't want to be painting sort of tufts of hair where they're not needed, but you do want to make sure that you are overlapping some of those details to make your subject look like part of that painting. You don't want it to look like a sticker that's just been stuck on, and that can happen if you end up with harsh edges around your subject. So for instance here, that's why I've turned my canvas round. I'm dragging my brush across over to the background so that I don't have a harsh edge. On the top of the head where the ears join onto the face, again there are 3 or 4 details that overlap that background. And that same principle goes for the details that I'm painting here. So whenever I've got any part of the face that overlaps any other element, so for instance here where the chin is in front and next to the chest, those hairs on the chin are going to overlap that neck fur, but you'll notice that I haven't painted the chin in at all yet. The reason being, those details are going to overlap the neck. I need to paint that fur in, and then I can add the chin fur in that's going to overlap this portion below it. If I'd have painted the chin first and then done the details, then I was to have started on the neck, I'm going to have to paint around all of those chin hairs. That's going to make the process much longer and just much more complex than it needs to be. So whenever you've got any part of a portrait where something looks like it's behind that fur, always paint that in first and then tackle the bit that looks on top. Not only is that going to make everything much easier, but it is going to make it look more realistic because you're indicating then that that part of the body is further in front and closer to the viewer. It's therefore going to help with that overall 3D look and shape of that animal that we're going for. So following on from that, it's really important that the whiskers are left until the last layer. As I say, because they do overlap everything else, they are the last thing there that overlaps all of the fur. I want to make sure that I'm showing that in that portrait. Now, because the whiskers are in some cases much longer, cat whiskers for instance are incredibly long in some cases, if I was to paint them in too early on, I'm going to have to then paint around all of them, and that is going to be so much harder. So always do make sure that you leave the whiskers until that last layer. Now it's really important, I'll bring this up now because I have nearly done it myself. I did photograph a portrait, did all the editing process, almost sent it to my client, and then I realised that I hadn't painted in the whiskers. So now I always make sure that I've got a little note to the side of my easel. I always want to be making sure I'm painting those in. They do make such a difference. So although I say it's really important to leave them till the last layer, it's also really important that we don't forget about them. So one last tip I'd like to mention is using a liner brush and how to care for it. Now here you'll see that the paint is only on the last tip of the bristles themselves. It's not actually pushed all the way up to the black section where the bristles start. That's really important. If that paint dries up there, that's what's going to make the liner brush split into 2. So if you're finding that that's happening, it is because you're getting the paint far too close to the base of the bristles. So I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video are useful. If they were, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And as I've mentioned, if my slower tutorials in pastels or acrylics are of use, I will link my Patreon in the description below. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video very soon. As always, thank you so much for watching.